I'm Chef Drew here at Three House, and welcome to the inaugural program of Adulting 101. Today, first I'm just going to talk about a couple of pantry staples, and then we're going to go ahead and make a basic white sauce, but then we're going to make it into a homemade macaroni and cheese. So starting with the very basics, most people already know about salt and pepper, so make sure you have some salt and pepper in your pantry. You can use regular salt. There are some other varieties of salt, like smoked salt and flavored salts. Black pepper. I prefer to use ground black pepper as often as possible, but always make sure you have some black pepper in your pantry. And then the other two staples I always make sure I have on hand are garlic and onion. And you can use either powder or granulated, but they're incorporated in a lot of recipes, and I just think they add another layer of flavor. And then going up to the next level on spices, paprika can be used either mostly as a coloring. So there's a regular paprika that doesn't have a whole lot of flavor, but is mostly a coloring agent. And then you have a smoked paprika, which you can use on barbecues and to add another layer of flavor. And then related to paprika is cayenne pepper. Most of you might be familiar with this as adding a little heat to most dishes. I brought some of my derivatives of cayenne, different types of peppers from home. So if you decide that you like hot peppers, there are different whole family of peppers that you can add layering different levels of heat to your dish. And so you have everything from green chilies to hot peppers. And if you see 60K or 90K, that stands for the heat units, Scoville units. So that's 60,000 Scoville units, 90,000 Scoville units. For reference, jalapeno tends to be about 3,000 to 6,000 heat units. So once you get into the tens and hundreds of thousands of heat units, it's quite hot. In fact, now with the ghost peppers and the Carolina Reapers, they get up into the millions of heat units, which most of us average people will never ever even try. Personally, my comfort level is somewhere around 100 to 120,000 heat units. So when I cook for other people, I usually try to keep it under about 10,000. So that would still be considered hot, but not blazingly hot. And then lastly, I think everyone needs to have a little bit of chili powder or some kind of an herbal component. Italian seasoning, these work really well as all-purpose blends. This is a mild chili powder. So if you don't want a hot chili, you can skip the hot peppers and just use this, and you'll still get plenty of a Mexican flavoring, but without any of the heat. So this serves as your base, and then you can just add some peppers. So that's kind of, if you have these stocked in your pantry, along with butter, flour, and sugar, I think this will serve as a good basis for spicing anything you might want to cook. So today I'm going to start with what's known as one of the mother sauces in French cooking. I'm actually doing a little variation. Bechamel sauce is the French sauce. I'm just going to make a basic white sauce. And once I make this white sauce, this serves as a basis. You can add other ingredients to this. I'll show you how to make the sauce, but at the time the sauce is done, you could add a bouillon cube or some chicken flavoring, make a chicken gravy or a beef gravy. You could add any kind of ingredients because it serves as a basic white sauce. So first thing you do is you make what's called a roux. So on a medium-high heat, you might see different recipes for this, the roux. In classical training, you would always use equivalent amounts of flour and whatever fat you're using. So you can make a roux with lard, shortening, butter, olive oil. Classically, you'd always use butter. So I've measured out 4 tablespoons of butter. You want to melt that in your pan. And once that gets just to the point where it's melted and kind of frothing a little bit, it gets a little foamy, then we're going to add our flour, and we're going to whip our flour into it. So while that's melting, I'll get my whisk out. So we have our butter melting now. It hasn't quite started to foam, but I'm going to get my flour ready. So once that's completely melted, I'm going to add 4 level tablespoons of flour. I'm going to do 2 at a time. Whisk it in, make sure it's nice and incorporated. Make sure there's no lumps. And this step is pretty forgiving. If you're off by a teaspoon or so, it's not really going to make much of a difference. Some people like the roux a little thinner, some people like it a little thicker. So this is what's called a roux, R-O-U-X, and it's just a fat and flour mixed together. So at this point, this is what it looks like. I'm going to cook this down just a little bit more to get rid of the raw flour flavor. In some KJ cooking, you would cook this down till it's actually like a chocolate brown color for your etouffees and gumbos, jambalayas. But for most purposes, you want what's called a blonde roux. So basically, you're only cooking this down for 2-3 minutes until the raw flour flavor cooks out. As soon as that starts to bubble, then we're going to add our milk. But since I want a little more flavor than a basic white sauce, if this was a true French bechamel, you take a whole onion and stud it with cloves, and you boil your milk first, and then add it to your roux. But we're not going to get that complicated today. So I'm just going to take a 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder and a 1/4 teaspoon of onion powder, and I'm going to put that in the roux and whisk it in. And you're actually going to start smelling that pretty soon. We're going to try to incorporate that. And as you can see, it's starting to bubble now. It's starting to foam a little bit. That's perfect. That's the time you want to start adding your milk. So some recipes call for warming your milk first or scalding it. I have not found that necessary if you stir constantly as you add the milk. I don't add the milk all at once, a little bit at a time, and just make sure that I'm constantly stirring and breaking that gravy up, or that roux up a little bit. And then as this cooks down, eventually it's going to reach the texture of like a gravy. Well, that's going to take a few minutes, so just be patient. Just as you're stirring, look in and make sure that you don't see any big chunks of flour floating around. So we're continuing to stir. It's just slightly beginning to thicken now. You can see the steam coming up. So this will thicken a little bit more. I can smell the onion and the garlic in there. So it's not just flour, butter, and milk. It's got a little bit of flavor already, which is what I want. So the point at which you know that the white sauce is done is when it coats the back of a spoon. So you can see now it's almost there. It's thickening up a little bit, but it's still a little milky. So we're going to let this go for another minute or two. And then when it reaches about the texture consistency of what you think is a good gravy, that's when we're going to add our cheese. So I've opted to use grated cheese and Velveeta for convenience. You can always buy a block of cheese, grate it with your box grater if you want. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I decided to go with some creamy melt cheese that has some cream cheese already in it. It makes it a nice smooth melt. The idea with homemade mac and cheese is to find the cheese you like, or experiment with cheeses you've never tried. A really trendy one right now is one using Gruyere, which is a Swiss cheese. If I were to add just Gruyere cheese to the sauce right now, it'd be called a Mornay sauce, which is one of the variations of mother sauce in French cuisine. So I went with the traditional cheddar, a little bit of white cheese, and the Velveeta gives it the smoothness you want. So this is really close. Hasn't quite started to bubble around the edges yet. It's just now starting to bubble around the edges. And you can see how it's thickened up a little bit. I'm gonna let it go for about 1 more minute, and I'm gonna start adding my cheese a cup at a time. So for this recipe, I've got a total of 3 cups of cheese. So I went with a cup of Velveeta, a cup of the 2 different flavors of Kraft. And again, this recipe is fairly forgiving. You can, if you like a cheesy macaroni and cheese, you can add more cheese. cup here or there. And going back to the white sauce, I used a whole milk on this white sauce. You can use a skim milk if you want. You may have to adjust maybe another half tablespoon of flour or so, but I don't think so. Because when we're done making our macaroni and cheese, we're actually gonna put this one in the oven and bake. So it's gonna thicken up a little bit while it's in the oven. So this is a nice texture. It's right about where I want it. So I use the whole milk with this, and I use butter and I use flour. You could use skim milk, you could use olive oil if you want something with a little bit less fat content. But this, I'm making this as a comfort food, so I want this as thick, rich, creamy as possible. And I don't want any lumps, I don't want any graininess. Sometimes if you use this super aged cheddar, you're gonna get a little bit of grain in your macaroni and cheese. The flavor is gonna be delicious, but it's not gonna have that same smoothness. So I'm gonna add this in 1 cup at a time. I'm gonna start with the grated cheese first. Incorporate that. Stir constantly. You don't want this to stick to the bottom, stick to the sides, or scorch. So I did lower the flame a little bit after I got the white sauce to the texture I wanted. You can see that's thickening up nicely. And so I'm just gonna break the Velveeta up a little bit so it'll incorporate faster. You can cut that ahead of time if you want. Some people like to put a little bit of dry mustard, like a 1/4 teaspoon or like maybe a tablespoon of Dijon mustard, which is another flavor component. But I wanted to keep this recipe as simple as possible. So we're just gonna start with this cheese sauce. And as soon as this Velveeta melts, this cheese sauce is actually ready to go. So we're gonna put that on a super low heat, just to keep that warm. We're gonna bring our water to a boil, and we're gonna get our noodles ready. So essentially what we've done is we made a white sauce, added cheese to it, turned it into a cheese sauce. That's gonna sit, and then we're gonna boil our noodles, drain them. We're gonna pour this over the noodles, put some breadcrumbs on it, and bake it in the oven. So it's a really easy recipe. There's essentially really only 3 steps. Make the sauce, boil the noodles, bake it in the oven. And I personally like a little bit of spice in mine, so I'll put some hot sauce in here or use some of the peppers that I showed you earlier. And that's totally up to you. And then when the whole thing is finished, talking about the salts, they have what are called finishing salts. So when the whole thing is done and right before you plate it and eat it, you can add a couple of different salts. This one is a cedar smoked salt, so it adds a little bit of smokiness. And this would go really well with that smoked paprika if you're into smoky things. And then this is a truffle salt. Truffled macaroni and cheese is a trendy staple in restaurants right now. And this is a good, inexpensive way to add a little bit of truffle flavor. The oils tend to be very expensive, but you can just take a little bit of this, sprinkle it on top of your serving of macaroni and cheese if that's what you like. And it's just a way to elevate a simple macaroni and cheese and bring it to a level of restaurant quality. So this is my sauce. Just maybe a few little bit of the Velveeta left in there, but that's gonna melt down. I like this texture. This is right about where I want it. If you like yours a little bit thicker, like I said, this is a pretty forgiving sauce. You could add maybe another 1/4 cup of cheese or so in here if you wanted, without too much difficulty. But we're gonna set that to the side right now. We're gonna boil our noodles. Some questions I get about boiling noodles sometimes is, do you need to add oil to your water, or when do you add salt to the water? So the short answer is you never need to add oil to your water to keep the noodles from sticking, as long as you don't crowd your noodles. Make sure you got a big enough pot for the number of noodles you're using. If for whatever reason you have a crowded pot and you don't have, you're cooking a lot of noodles, you don't have a bigger pot, at that point I'd say it's okay to go ahead and stir a little bit of oil or butter into your noodles. But generally speaking, especially in the restaurant business, you would never put any oil in your water. And as far as adding salt, I always wait until it's either almost to a boil or at a boil before I add any salt. The problem being you can get pits on the bottom of your pan. If you add the salt with cold water, that salt's going to sit on the bottom, it's not going to dissolve. It can cause a little bit of corrosion on the bottom of your pans. So I always wait till it's at least bubbling, it's at a good simmer, there's some steam coming up. Okay, cheese sauce looks pretty good. Water's starting to simmer. I'm just gonna put about a teaspoon of salt in there. That'll lower that boiling temperature, help it come to a boil a little faster. And also it's gonna season your noodles a little bit. So once I boil my noodles, I'm gonna drain them. Another question I get sometimes is, do you rinse your noodles? The short answer is usually not. If you're gonna make a cold pasta salad or something, you wanna cool your noodles down and stop the cooking immediately, then the answer is yes. But when you cook the noodles and you drain them, some of that starch clings to the outside of that noodle, and so if you're putting something with a sauce, you want that sauce to cling to the outside of the noodle. So you do not want to drain or rinse your noodles after you drain them if you want the sauce to cling. If you want a clean noodle, or if you want to cool it and stop the cooking, then go ahead and rinse it off when you're done in some cold water, set it aside. We are actually going to take, once our noodles have boiled and we drain them, we're going to put them right into a casserole pan, pour the sauce over them, and pop them in the oven with some breadcrumbs on it. So we want that starch on the outside of that noodle so that that sauce is going to cling and you have a nice, thick, creamy macaroni and cheese. So we're going to pause right here for a second. So we have our cheese sauce made. It's nice and creamy. I just tasted it. It's right where I want it. I think it's got a good balance. I've got my water to a full roaring boil. I picked shells. I know a lot of people do this with elbows. Elbows would work fine. I happen to like shells. The idea is you want a pasta that's going to hold up to a little bit of baking, and you want a pasta that's got some kind of a tubular shape or something that's going to hold some of that cheese, so you don't want to use a spaghetti or linguine or anything like that. You're just going to end up with a gloppy mess. You want a noodle that's going to be a little bit firm. If you ever look on the box and it gives you the direction on how long to cook, and it says al dente. Al dente means to the tooth or with a little tooth, and that means it's still going to have a little bit of firmness to it. My experience has been that most Americans like their noodles cooked past the way most Europeans do, or the way most restaurants, and especially Italian restaurants do. So since we're going to put this in the oven, I would cook it to the al dente, whatever it says, a minute less than you normally would. But if you do like soft, mushy noodles, cook them the way you want, that's fine. I'm not going to say anything. But I only need half this box, so I'm just going to basically eyeball this. I'm just going to pour half in here. And again, like I said, it's pretty forgiving. You don't have to be exact on this. You'll know if you have too much or too little of something, and you can always adjust it later. Just remember, this is your first time trying this, so if it doesn't come out exactly how you want, you can always adjust it the next time. Especially with the cheeses, I highly recommend that you experiment with different cheeses that you know you like. I will say though, the harder, firmer cheeses are probably not going to melt as well, and you're going to get that grainy texture I talked about when I was talking about the aged cheddars. So if you're going to use a Gouda or something like that, I'd use a young Gouda. And a good reference is you can pick up a block of cheese and just kind of press your thumb into it. And if you're able to press your thumb into it and make an imprint, it's probably going to melt pretty well. It might break and you might get a little bit of grease on top of your sauce, but you can always just keep stirring it, and then once you bake it in the oven, your breadcrumbs are going to take care of that. So these are going to cook for 8 minutes, and we'll wait till they're done. So So our noodles have boiled for approximately 8 minutes. I just tested a noodle. It's still a little bit al dente. It's not mushy yet. It's still got a little bit of firmness to it. So we're going to take it off the heat. We're going to drain it in the sink. And again, this was half a package, so 8 ounces of noodles. And also, while I was doing that, I melted 3 tablespoons of butter and a little bit of the garlic, the onion powder, and a little bit of paprika in here. And this is what we're gonna do our breadcrumbs with. But in the meantime, we're gonna pour our noodles into this pan. And while my noodles are draining, I'm gonna put just a little bit of cheese sauce on the bottom. You don't have to do this, but I do this sometimes because some pans it seems like the noodles stick a little bit more. I feel like if I put just a little bit of sauce down first, there's some sauce on the bottom and the noodles don't stick quite as bad. So we've drained our noodles but not rinsed them. Like I said, we want the starch. And once you've done this a few times, if you look really closely, you can see that the noodles still have a little bit of a darker texture in the middle, darker color. And that means that they're al dente because these are gonna bake for a half hour in the oven. If you wanted to eat these right now, you could cook them off for another minute and just mix this whole thing together. And you could eat this as is. You don't have to bake this any longer. But since this is gonna be a baked casserole dish and we're gonna put some breadcrumbs on top, we are gonna go ahead and just smother these noodles in this cheese sauce. That is the texture I want. You could actually go, if yours is a little bit thinner than this, I wouldn't worry about it because it is gonna bake in the oven for a half hour. The sauce is gonna absorb some of the starches from those noodles. The noodles are gonna absorb some of the sauce, so it's gonna thicken up a little bit. I happen to like a thick macaroni and cheese, so I think this is gonna be just fine. If you like yours a little bit thinner, you can always add, another quarter cup of milk in here before you put it with your noodles. And so I used whole milk in my cheese sauce. You can use skim milk, like I said earlier, or even a combination of half and half and heavy cream. When I make this at home, I tend to use a combination of half and half and heavy cream. And it turns out thicker, so at that point you can add a little bit of chicken broth or chicken stock or something like that if you think it's going to be too thick. But once again, I encourage you to experiment with this, with different types of cheeses and maybe different types of milks, half and half, heavy cream, whatever, until you get the exact texture consistency you want. So the basic recipe that I use today is going to work every time. It's going to be a basic recipe, and then from there is when you can do some optional stuff. So like I said, this is ready to eat right now. You can eat this as is, everything's cooked. The noodles are still just a little firm. They're about a minute undercooked, what most people like them. So this is ready to go. Now all we're gonna do is brown some breadcrumbs. So I've got the 3 tablespoons of butter in here. I'm gonna put my breadcrumbs in and I'm gonna stir them around. I want them to coat up some of that butter. And since I'm using a bigger casserole pan, this recipe will fit in a 8x8, and I'm using a little bit bigger. So I'm gonna add just a little bit more breadcrumbs. And I have to be using the Italian style. You can use whatever you want. I find though that if you want a lower salt content, to use the panko breadcrumbs, have very little salt. So I'm just gonna add, I don't know, maybe a tablespoon or so in here. Make sure I get good coverage. So I'm just going to stir that up a little bit. Just going to make sure those breadcrumbs soak up all that butter. going to try to give it a nice even coating. And this is another place where you can get creative if you want to crunch out some Cheetos and put them on top of here, some Flamin' Hot Cheetos, some French onion like you put on the green bean casserole at Thanksgiving. Anything you want. Some people put chow mein noodles, Ruffles, Ripple chips, whatever you want. I just went with the standard breadcrumbs, and I went with the Italian because I like garlic, onion, herbal components in my things. If your family doesn't, just use the regular unflavored breadcrumbs. They work just as well. So I got almost full coverage on that. So then we're just going to take this, put this in a 350-degree oven, which has been preheated. We're going to bake for 25 to 30 minutes. You'll know it's done and it'll start bubbling. It should be bubbling around the edges. And the breadcrumbs will start getting a little bit brown. I've done this both covered and uncovered, and I think if you just do it for a half hour like this, your breadcrumbs will be browned without burning. So you could cover if you want and then uncover for the last 15 minutes, but I haven't found that that's necessary if you use this amount of breadcrumbs. If you heaped them up and you use the crispy French fried onions, I would probably cover it first and then uncover it for the last 10-15 minutes of cooking. So we're gonna put this in the oven. In 25-30 minutes, it should be ready to eat. Okay, we cooked this about 25 minutes. See how it's bubbling? Breadcrumbs a little brown around the edges. That should be perfect. Enjoy.